and welcome to today's program of 10 Minutes with Tina Toke. Today, we'll be discussing the negative consequences of using marijuana and why it should not be legal in the United States. We're going to guide our discussion with three main topics. To begin today's discussion, let's look at some basic facts about marijuana.
So what exactly is marijuana? Well, marijuana is actually just one of many drugs that can be produced from the hemp plant, or the cannabis sativa, but it is definitely the most common. Marijuana can be ingested by consumption via food or drink, but it is most commonly smoked by way of a joint, bong, or blunt. Over 400 chemicals can be found in a typical joint, but THC is the most prevalent, and is the chemical that gives the high experienced when doing marijuana. When the smoke enters the bloodstream, the chemicals travel to the brain and react with cannabinoid receptors, resulting in the desired high, but also negatively affecting brain functions like memory and perception.
It is a widely accepted fact that marijuana is a mind-altering substance with some short-term consequences, but the reality is that it is much more harmful than that. And use can create long-term complications with one's mind and body.
Meet Mary Jane. She is a typical teenager, except for the fact that she is a recovering marijuana addict.
I started smoking pot my sophomore year of high school. I thought how cool it would be, getting high would be, but I thought marijuana couldn't be that dangerous. I mean, it's not on the same level as hard drugs or like cocaine or heroin, so why worry?
According to the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, marijuana's long-term effects show changes in the brain similar to the effects of cocaine use. Marijuana can impair the parts of the brain involved in memory, thinking, attention, perception, and other areas, even weeks after the last time it was used.
I couldn't have been more wrong. Using marijuana impacted me in ways I never expected.
Mary Jane had always been a good student at school. She was in the accelerated classes and everything. Maybe it was the workload that drove her to try it. I don't know. But about halfway through her sophomore year, I started to see her grades slip. I thought it was just the rigor of the classes, but slowly the B's started dropping to C's and even some D's.
I've always cared a lot about my grades, but after I started doing weed, all I'd cared about was getting high. I didn't care about turning in my homework or studying for tests. All I was focusing on was where my next hit was coming from.
The Office of National Drug Control Policy states that students who use marijuana experience impaired ability to concentrate and retain information. Studies show that marijuana users are 3 times as likely to report C average grades and 6 times as likely to report D or lower average grades.
I started seeing personality changes in Mary Jane. She went from this happy-go-lucky girl I knew to this moody, withdrawn. Sometimes she got violent and would lash out at me if I asked her if anything was wrong.
I started pulling away from my family and my friends because I hated who I'd become. It was me against the world. I was lonely and depressed. I even considered committing suicide. Life was just too hard when I wasn't high.
Studies show that adolescents who have used marijuana are more likely to demonstrate these personality changes. Marijuana users are twice as likely to feel isolated and depressed, have thoughts or plans of suicide, and have violent or aggressive behavior.
I was so desperate to find out where I was getting my weed from that I started stealing from my parents and even my boyfriend. Finally, my mom caught me and gave me a choice. Either get clean or face the legal consequences.
Mary Jane has been clean now for about 10.5 months, with the help of treatment and support.
We're all really glad to see her back to her old self again.
If I could tell my past self one thing, it would be not to try that first joint. I had no idea how much marijuana would change me. I think a lot of people don't realize that it's not physically addicting. It's the psychological addiction that can be just as devastating.
Now that we've seen some of the behavioral and psychological effects of marijuana, let's look at some of the physical health effects. Dr. Dope is here to share some facts.
Marijuana is very dangerous to a person's physical well-being and has many negative consequences in various areas of the body. Over the past decade, there has been a 200% increase in emergency room cases attributed to marijuana. And in 2009, almost 387,000 emergency department visits were due to marijuana. Within only a few minutes of ingesting marijuana, a user's heart rate increases perhaps even by 20 to 50 beats per minute, and it raises blood pressure. Users have 4.8 times greater risk of having a heart attack in the first hour after smoking compared to non-users. Smoking marijuana presents a similar risk to respiratory system as smoking tobacco. However, the effects can actually be more dangerous. A single joint leaves about 4 times more tar in the lungs and emits around 50 to 70% more carcinogens than smoking does. Down the road, this increases respiratory illness, including bronchitis, lung infections, and even lung cancer.
Thanks, Doc. Now we're going to switch gears and look at the economics of marijuana. Proponents say that legalization would reap economic benefits. However, this theory has been oversimplified. Let's talk to Professor Pott to learn more.
Well, the general opinion is that legalization proponents have is that legalizing and regulating marijuana would significantly boost the economy. However, this is simply not the case. The entire illicit marijuana market is estimated to bring in about $10 billion in revenue per year. This is only about 0.1% of our nation's gross domestic product. Therefore, the perceived enormous tax revenues that a legal marijuana market would bring in actually would affect the economy very little. Furthermore, if marijuana were to be legalized, the greater demand for it, as well as the legal status, would actually cause the price of the drug to drop, and in turn bring less tax revenue. Additionally, as more people begin to use marijuana without fear of the legal consequences, the social costs of the drug would increase. More money will have to be spent to take care of accidents, lower productivity, and addiction, as evidenced by the alcohol market, and that's the seemingly large $8 billion revenue offsets very little of the $200 billion spent to deal with the social consequences. The steep taxes that would come along with regulating marijuana would continue to foster marijuana's black market, as it is in Washington, where marijuana is legal. Taxes come to 25% across the different stages of production, and this doesn't even include any local or state sales tax. A proposed national marijuana legalization reform suggests that 50% of tax on marijuana production. In order to avoid these steep taxes, dealers and purchasers will still use the black market. This is evidenced by Canada, where 30% of tobacco is bought and sold illicitly to avoid heavy taxes, even though it is a legal substance. All in all, the combination of steep taxes, social costs, and an already relatively small revenue indicates that legalizing marijuana would not be economically beneficial. The pros simply do not outweigh the cons.
Thank you, Professor. Finally, we're going to look at what the social impacts of legalizing marijuana would be. The primary effect of legalizing marijuana would be increased use of the drug, which encompasses a number of other social impacts. Before we look at what these other impacts are, let's see what evidence there is to support the increased use of the drug.
3 main factors play into this conclusion. A. Legalization would send a clear message that downplays the dangers of marijuana. B. Legalization would remove legal consequences as a deterrent. C. Legalization would create a legal market, providing an increased supply and lower prices. Additionally, a look at the Netherlands provides an example of how liberalizing marijuana laws resulted in an increase in use and social consequences. In the 70s and 80s, the Netherlands loosened their enforcement of marijuana policies. Between 1984 and 1996, the number of adolescents who reported having done marijuana once tripled, and the number reporting using it in a 30-day period doubled. Along with this increase in use came increased drug abuse and crime. Additionally, these liberal marijuana laws have produced a generation of people who think marijuana is harmless. The Netherlands has the lowest number of school children out of 35 surveyed European countries who perceive great risks in using marijuana.
So what are the consequences of increased marijuana use? According to studies, the impacts can range anywhere from violence and crime to car accidents to use of harder drugs. Let's find out what Mrs. Harriet Hash, a social worker specializing in drug abuse, has to say about the connection between violence and marijuana.
Many of the kids I see and hear end up with me because their drug abuse has led them to act out violently. As it is, adolescents who use marijuana weekly are more likely to engage in violence than those not using weekly. Also, violent or criminal behaviors, such as physical attacks or stealing or destroying property, directly increase with the frequency of marijuana use. I think one of the most shocking statistics testifying to the connection between marijuana and violence is that 68.4% of students who reported hurting others with a weapon at school also reported marijuana use. If marijuana were to be legalized, we would see much more of this violence among our youth.
Proponents of legalization use the drug war as an example of how legalization would actually decrease violence, because the most widely trafficked illicit drug would no longer be illegal and a source of fuel for the drug war. However, very little of drug war violence would actually come to an end, as the main contributors are drugs like cocaine, heroin, or methamphetamine. And as it turns out, marijuana acts as a gateway drug, which leads users to try and even abuse these harder drugs.
Meet Wendy Weed. Wendy and her twin sister Wanda took part in a study conducted by the American Medical Association. The study looked at how twins differ in their drug-using habits.
Wanda and I are identical twins. We have the same biological makeup, very similar personalities, and we grew up in the same house together. Almost everything about Wanda and I is the same, except when I was in high school, I started experimenting with pot and Wanda didn't. Ever since then, Wanda and I have lived drastically different lives. When Wendy and I were 14, she started using weed. However, I strayed on the straight and narrow. To be honest, Wendy never seemed to have that many problems with using weed. Her grades were okay, her personality stayed the same, and she didn't get into much trouble. But then a lot of her problems started to come down the road in her adult life. When I was 21, I chose to try cocaine. I didn't think I'd have a problem with it because marijuana wasn't such a big issue for me. But the truth was much different. I ended up abusing cocaine and became dependent on it. While Wanda was succeeding in college, I was busy being a cokehead.
The twin study that Wendy and Wanda took part in showed that the marijuana-using twins were 4 times as likely to use cocaine or crack cocaine, and 5 times as likely to use hallucinogens like LSD.
Additionally, studies show that the younger a person is when they start using marijuana, the more likely they are to use harder drugs later in life. For example, one study showed that 62% of adults who used cocaine had used marijuana before age 15. Another study demonstrated that those who used marijuana before age 14 were twice as likely to become dependent on illicit drugs as those who used marijuana between ages 15 and 17, and 6 times as likely as those who started marijuana after age 18. A third social impact of legalization and increased use of marijuana is an increase in motor vehicle accidents. Just like alcohol, driving under the influence of marijuana can be very dangerous as it impairs cognitive and motor abilities. Officer Sativa is here to discuss what she's seen on the motorways.
Well, I do think that along with legalizing marijuana will come more impaired drivers. I mean, if we look at Montana, for example, where more of those medical marijuana cards have been distributed, there's already been an increase in DUI arrests and fatal car accidents where the driver had marijuana in their system. But even without legal status, there are just too many people driving while under the influence of cannabis. Even sometimes more than drunk driving. In 2006, a study reported that 13% of high school seniors said they had driven under the influence of marijuana, while only 10% under the influence of 5 or more drinks. And in 2007, another study showed that in a sample of weekend nighttime drivers, drugs were found 7 times more frequently than alcohol. Now, all you folks out on the roads, I want you to remember, driving under the influence of cannabis doubles the risk of a fatal road crash occurring. So make sure you're driving responsibly.
Thanks, Officer Sativa. Well, we sure have learned a lot today about why marijuana should not be legalized in the United States. We've seen the detrimental health effects of using marijuana, the cost that would occur with legalization, and the social effects that would only become more frequent with liberalized policy. I hope these facts have provided you with a better understanding of the marijuana issue, and that you enjoyed today's program. This has been 10 Minutes with Tina Toke. See you next time!